Mm-hmm.
So that's a continued conversation we'll be having.
Great. And so maybe kind of highlight that point I think that you're making, which is, we've had this conversation since those very early meetings a couple years ago where, our comprehensive plan is a legal document that has to achieve a few specific things. It's our legal overarching land use plan that guides our zoning. It's our transportation and infrastructure investment plan. And then we are expanding beyond that in Minneapolis to incorporate some of these bigger themes. So there's sort of that push and pull about what's the right level of detail on some of the issues that we're incorporating into the physical environment, land use, kind of core issues of the comp plan, like health, like safety, like equity, and which things will be in other policies or documents. So this will never be every health policy that the city is working on, for an example. So just to underscore the sort of approach of trying to weave it into those core items of the comp plan's scope. Right.
Absolutely.
Madam Chair. And, I get that. But as I look at the goals, in 2040, Minneapolis will be resilient to the effects of climate change and diminishing natural resources. And we will be on track, very specific, to achieve 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. I imagine there are lots of things that we can do to do that don't necessarily involve the built environment. I suppose you could have more trees. That would be one thing that would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. But so all I'm saying is this is really important. This is really important. It's as important as climate change. Thank you.
Understood.
So we'll then follow up there on the specific edits. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm really glad we got to do this in a meeting that didn't have a dozen other things on the agenda, and it became an afterthought rather than a priority. I had a couple of issues. I'll start with the public safety issue. I see it manifest itself this way. If we have windows on South Nicollet that are covered to the top with advertising, that's a crime prevention by environmental design issue, which is a built environment thing. And if we don't have enough inspectors to tell them to take down the advertising in the windows, it backs up to an issue of not abiding by the code, creating a public safety issue, which gets to the issue of both perception of crime and reality of crime. So I do see public safety as actually affecting resources in the city, because I think the good folks in zoning enforcement would tell you they don't have enough staff. And when I call someone and say the windows in front of the new hotel on Hennepin are completely covered with advertising, and we've had 3 inspectors out and they still refuse to take them down, and then there's a crime on Hennepin on a Sunday night at 2 a.m, and no one's sitting in the lobby of that hotel looking out at it to be eyes on the street for us, that then does come back to being a public safety issue. So I do think public safety through crime prevention by physical design is a direct connection to the comprehensive plan. And I'm worried that not that I suggest we have 7 more zoning inspectors, and Councilmember Johnson says we don't need, Johnson says we don't need 7 more. It's not in the comp plan, which I don't think he would say. He could use the comp plan document to say there's nothing in here that says that public safety is an issue. So I think it plays itself out by design. And my example of covered windows is like the perfect one. When you have street level crime on South Nicollet, half the reason is there aren't eyes on the street, and cameras are just not going to be enough. There have to be actual looking in, looking out. That's a zoning and planning issue. I'm wondering why neighborhoods are not noted in the overarching plan goals as our primary method of getting information out as partners with the city.
The goals were designed to be more content-based rather than process-based. So there will be, we've designed our civic engagement process for this comprehensive plan to be pretty comprehensive in how we do engagement. We haven't done the type of engagement for this type of document before. And so in the goals themselves, it's really about the content. It's about the topics that the research teams are working on and where they see themselves in that, where the community sees themselves in the actual topics. And so that's just the only reason. We just really don't have a lot of goals about process.
But in my ward, people see themselves as part of a neighborhood more than they do, not necessarily a neighborhood association, but in many cases they do, but they connect to the city via a neighborhood. And then by virtue of having this network of neighborhood associations, they connect in that way. And I kind of feel like leaving out the fact that we rely on these neighborhoods to do work for us, because we do.
Mm-hmm.
That's our system. By leaving that word out somewhere says more than just having it in here. I mean, I'm sure there'll be a discussion later about comments regarding valuing neighborhood associations, but by not stating that neighborhood associations are under ordinance, our system, you create a paranoia level that results in one comment being taken totally out of context. And so I think maybe recognizing neighborhood associations as a way people think about where they live in the city would do a lot to buffer over that potentially irrational concern. So I think would urge you to think about how you could think about that.
Okay, thank you.
And then my last comment has to do with something that a lot of our colleagues have been on an email string all week. It's about treating each other with respect, not each other here, but like each other and the community. What, ma'am?
That would be nice.
Yeah. So, I mean, so my example would be a house that was a vacant property that then there was a fire and how that's been torturing the neighbor next door. And we don't have anything in here about one of our goals being that we treat each other broadly defined in our city with respect. I realize that we can't regulate behavior, but if respect was a goal of the city, respecting your colleagues, respecting your neighbors, respecting the health department as much as respecting the police, I think that would go a long way to say what we view as the Minneapolis way. And when that isn't noted as respect being something important, it blows up into fights between neighbors, between council members and constituents, and potentially between council members and staff or each other. So I do think this concept of treating each other well, always assuming the best, not the worst, should be reflected some way as part of the Minneapolis way of doing things. I don't want to see us inching towards the behavior of the federal situation. I want to see us advocating for having our own value. In our city goals conversation at the beginning of this term, I was the strongest advocate for and lost having the top city goal being happiness. Maybe I'm just too close to the Scandinavian environment where happiness is a massive measurement of how people's wellness is, but I'll back now off of happiness and move on to just the general idea of treating each other with respect. I think if we said that more, people would act that way more towards each other, and I think it would be a good thing to have as part of our goals.
Okay. Well, thanks for all this discussion. I agree. And I also think, as I kind of, our little side conversation was as elected officials, the more that we can sort of model that behavior ourselves, the better, I think. So I will go ahead and move the resolution that Councilmember Reich and I authored together as members of the steering committee. I do want to read some pieces of it because I think it's important and reflects the important work that, again, I'm very thankful for your leadership as staff on this. You've worked very hard to engage hundreds of staff across the city enterprise in multiple departments in a way that hasn't happened before for this kind of plan, as well as all of the council members frequently briefing us individually, as well as thousands of people in the community. And again, this is unprecedented for this kind of plan, and I applaud your efforts. This is a resolution, again, Councilmember Reich and I have authored, establishing goals for the Minneapolis 2040 update to the city's comprehensive plan. The initial whereas clauses kind of reflect the legislative process that we've had, directing staff to begin the update, which included those goals that we adopted as a council at the beginning of our term. We received and filed and then adopted an engagement calendar for the plan itself that reflects the community engagement that's happening now. Whereas the Metropolitan Council projects the city's population to increase from an estimated 411,000 in 2014 to over 459,000 in 2040, and whereas the Metropolitan Council projects the city's number of households to increase from an estimated 175,119 to 204,000 in 2040. And whereas the Metropolitan Council projects the city's employment to increase from an estimated 308,000 in 2014 to 350,000 in 2040. So our city is growing. those whereas clauses state. Whereas the city of Minneapolis intends to meet or exceed these projections. And whereas among the 25 most populous metro areas, the Twin Cities metro has among the largest disparities between people of color and indigenous peoples compared with white non-Latinos in poverty rates, home ownership, employment, and level of education. And whereas many participants in the Minneapolis 2040 process thus far hope the plan will address disparities in jobs, housing, air quality, parks, public safety, and transit, including investing in more in geographic areas with the most inequities. And whereas Minneapolis has a history of housing patterns that were established through racially restrictive housing covenants and redlining practices that limited home ownership opportunities for people of color and indigenous peoples, and those same areas experience inequities in health and the social conditions that support health today. And whereas Minneapolis first grew around streetcar lines and then transportation decisions made in the mid-20th century divided Minneapolis neighborhoods and disproportionately impacted communities of color and indigenous peoples by expanding the amount of pavement devoted to vehicle traffic. And whereas rapid action is necessary to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and curtail the effects of climate change to which low-income communities are most vulnerable. And whereas the city's future growth must help eliminate disparities among people of color and indigenous peoples compared with white people, now therefore be it resolved by the City Council of the City of Minneapolis that the City Council directs the Department of Community Planning and Economic Development to update the city's comprehensive plan based on 13 overarching plan goals established through the Minneapolis 2040 engagement feedback and furthering the city's commitment to equitable outcomes in the built, natural, and economic environment. And then the resolution concludes by listing those plan goals that are on the screen today. So again, I've moved that item. I will see if there's any further discussion on the resolution. Councilmember Wright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to echo the comments that you made, and thanks to the work that's moving forward. As someone who co-chairs with you, you get to kind of observe firsthand the hours that get poured into what we have before us, and knowing that this is in some ways just the beginning of the formal process, the hours and hours that lay before you. So I salute you moving forward. I do want to make a couple of comments. I want to echo the notion that crime and safety need to be further highlighted. And I don't want to just leave it with that notion. I think I'm going to make a staff direction that you start with a map that reflects that data point, and then the relevant commentary that would follow the map that's consistent with the other map and commentary and observations that you've made. Of course, making it contextually relevant to the exercise of the final product that we're making. But I think you know what I mean when I say make the map, make the commentary, and make it relevant. The other staff direction that I wish to include in this is that it might seem like a small point, but it's a point that I think needs to be discussed a little bit. When we have a lot of commentary come in and we record all that commentary, I think that's appropriate, and I don't want to edit any of that commentary. But when one Post-it note becomes a thematic bullet point of somehow statistical relevance to this exercise, I'm just going to call that one as a big no. I call that as an outlier, not just an outlier, an extreme outlier. We're talking a rock outside of the orbit of Pluto outlier. It just doesn't belong there. I'm not even talking about the value of what it's commenting on or not. I'm just saying it just doesn't belong there as a bullet point. It's a Post-it note. Put it with the other Post-it notes and strike it. That's a staff direction. People can comment on it here, but that's what I want to include. Crime map and strike that bullet point.
Okay, so we have a motion for two different staff directions. I do want to ask staff to respond, and I'll just maybe give a little context here. So we haven't had a presentation or an action on a staff report like many of the hundreds that are available on our city's website, in staff in departments across the city, including NCR and the health department and CPED. But there is a bullet point in the report that has caused some interest and concern. And I thought your response at the steering committee actually helped me understand much better that question. So could you just kind of, either one of you, respond to this question about how did you decide which items to include in the staff report? Again, that is not a part of our action today. And then could you just kind of help us understand this bullet point, this one bullet point?
Sure. Madam Chair, members of the committee, I think I glossed over that process a little bit when I was talking about the documentation of the input that we've received so far. I did mention, of course, that we recorded verbatim everything that we heard and saw, and that we, with the help of some software, sorted all of that input according to those 20 topics that we showed in the slideshow. And in addition to making available the verbatim responses, that those 300 or 400 pages is sorted by topic, we put together a summary document that listed all of the ideas that we heard under those 20 topics. So some of them had 4 or 5 bullet points, some of them had more like 10 or 15 bullet points, depending on the number of ideas that we heard under each of those topics. Now, getting to Councilmember Reich's point and objection, the approach that we took, and I think reasonable folks can disagree about whether this was the right approach, but the approach that we took in that summary document was simply to list every idea that was in the verbatim documentation, regardless of how many times it showed up there. It was not intended to be a statistic analysis or to convey statistical significance by including a bullet point. It was simply to represent every idea that we heard.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Reich.
And that's great. And we have the historical record of all the comments made, and that's where I believe it truly belongs. I'm not trying to censor anything, but to put it in the bullet point suggests a pattern of significance. And one comment is not a pattern, nor is it significant. And that's just sort of one, sort of comment about what should be there, what shouldn't be based on form. But there's a practical consideration. We are trying to launch a process by which our historically relevant community groups who were created by the planning department to give input back in the 50s and continue to fulfill that service. Of course, that's a history we're not talking about. We're talking about Redline. We're not talking about our partners. Maybe that should be included in the report as well. But that'll be a later staff direction, maybe at full council when I can formulate it a little bit better. But moving forward, practically speaking, you're creating great damage. You're saying, you guys aren't significant. We don't really respect you. Just see how many people show up with that context. Practically speaking, it needs to go. But I also say as a matter of form, it is not showing a pattern and it's not showing a significant comment. It's highlighting one Post-it note. It needs to go back with the other Post-it notes. And we need to invite our neighborhood friends to the process where they belong.
So I'll just take a moment here to say that I know there are council members who want to speak. It's quite unusual. It's certainly in the purview of the council to make a staff direction on any item that we feel as policymakers rises to the level of us taking a direct action to direct staff. As my colleagues on TPW know, I often have a lot of questions for our public works staff. If we wanted to start taking staff directions for every time I disagree with public works reports, I think it would take us 100 hours to get through our work each cycle. So I think this is a bit of a dangerous and slippery slope for us to really get into this level of, on page 2 of item 4 of the Public Works report regarding 3rd Avenue bike lanes through downtown. I would move to change all of the language to say something else. It's something that we don't typically do as policymakers. So that is my perspective. I won't support any kind of action to edit in this kind of top-down way, the staff report that's intended to reflect as just simply a summary document. Of course, it's not a policy direction document. It's not in the goals. It's not in anything we're taking on action today. So that's my perspective. Councilmember Andrew Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I get the different perspectives on it. And I just wanted to say thank you to Councilmember Reich for bringing it forward. I agree with you, and I agree with your logic on this. I think there's a lot of historic context here with the neighborhood associations around the relationship with the city, and to see something like this come up is clearly concerning when a lot of us want to see that relationship improved and strengthened, and then to have this show up, it triggers a lot of past bad memories and history, and certainly I don't think we're aiming to censor anything here. I think keep it in the raw data, but to have it as a bullet point, I just think that what other ideas could have come forward that we would then put as bullet points that might not have fit that mold. I mean, there could be all sorts of things. I'm surprised others didn't, but I don't know that it makes sense to just put them in that document and call them out specifically. So I get the different perspectives, but I support the staff direction. Appreciate it coming forward in the debate on this. And, I think the fact that we don't typically do these staff directions for staff reports indicative of the sensitivity around this issue.
I will note we've spent more time talking about the bullet point than the comprehensive plan. Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I have to say I agree with my colleagues. And I want to go back to what Councilmember Goodman talked about in the goals, talking about how people in Minneapolis think about their city. I do think it is important that people do think of themselves first as a resident of a neighborhood and then part of a bigger group in the city. And, you know, my neighborhoods actually really got going. I mean, they had these historic names, but nobody knew it until we had the neighborhood revitalization plan. And it's really been interesting to me to watch that, to see how neighborhoods have developed their individual identity and, you know, are proud of some of the attributes that they have in particular in their neighborhoods. And I find it distressing that we don't engage these neighborhood groups. I'm really looking and actually pushing on some other large grants that we have. The neighborhood associations should be phase one of whatever we do in outreach to the community to ask for input, because we fund them. We should use them. And I see this particular thing and then other things that have come before me in some citywide initiatives, and I just don't see that use of those neighborhood associations. And I think it's a missed opportunity, and it subjects us then to needless criticism for ignoring them. So I support Councilmember Reich's staff direction.
Councilmember Goodman.
If we had a bullet point under our overarching plan goals highlighting the importance of how we communicate with neighborhoods, then this wouldn't be a problem. I want to make a suggestion. I personally think that taking that line item out is censorship. And the fact that so much has been highlighted about this has made the haters come out even more too. So if we had just left one line that represented one person's point of view in this document and reinforced that I believe all of us believe that neighborhoods are a critically important tool of working with community groups. And then one comment saying abolish neighborhoods would be one comment, but the overall goal would be that we support neighborhoods, and it would make sense that someone would make a contrary statement. I'm fearful now that all of this controversy surrounding one comment has made people who actually really feel this way come out more. It's raised this to a higher level than it needs. And remember, it's mainly neighborhoods in my ward that are upset about this. So I would like to see us not censor comments and accept that people tell us things we don't want to hear. But say what we believe in, which is why putting neighborhoods in the overarching plan goals and reinforcing that that is the point of view of the city would do more to support neighborhoods than silencing the one person who says we don't agree with you. So, Madam Chair, I would like to move that we move this forward without recommendation to the full council to see if we can get something that is a bigger victory for neighborhoods, which is adding neighborhoods and the importance of neighborhoods to the overall reaching plan goals.
Okay.
And then we can not have to worry about the one person's point of view that's probably now 100 people's point of view, given the amount of attention this has received in social media.
So I am going to continue to move this for approval through this committee. If folks want to vote against it, that's fine. I do want to note that staff met with every council member before this meeting today. And I do want to also reiterate a couple of other points. The last bullet point here in the overarching plan goals does talk about an overall commitment to process that's proactive, accessible, and financially sustainable. We actually have a blueprint for equitable engagement. Again, those details go through the Community Engagement Committee. I know there's not a lot of overlap between the council members who serve on this committee and that committee. That actually is a document and a series of policy actions that have, of course, come through the full council. So I hope folks have been able to become familiar with the blueprint for equitable engagement and all of that work that we've been doing to actually expand our community engagement tools. So we have a significant amount of funding in our neighborhoods and Community Relations Department that goes beyond the typical and very important work that our neighborhood organizations do. We've had many, many presentations over the last 3 years that highlight both the good work that neighborhood organizations are doing to become more diverse and the ongoing challenges that our neighborhood boards and our commissions. So I take responsibility as a policymaker who appoints those boards and commissions, do not reflect the population of our city. They do not racially reflect the populations of our city. The gender makeup of our boards and commissions and boards is not reflective of our overall population, and in many other factors, in income, in tenure, whether you rent or own a home. We know that we have work to do in the institutions that we rely on to continue to diversify and make more reflective. And so acknowledging that, all of our policies around community engagement that this council has adopted over the past 3 years have been about not only reiterating our support for our neighborhood organizations, including giving nearly $10 million of the funding that was removed in the previous council back to the neighborhood organizations before many of us were in office, but also continuing to expand the ways that we engage with communities that we know are underrepresented in our typical ways. And so I'm not comfortable rewriting the goals of our overarching land use and transportation infrastructure policy document to undermine or redo or edit the work that we have done together as a city council, 13 council members, over the past 3 years to make a lot of policy progress. Statement after statement, I believe all have unanimously passed. Perhaps maybe folks didn't actually support those votes, but we've taken them right over and over again as a council, and we have said that our commitment to our organizations, our city, and ourselves as council members is to continue to expand the ways that we are doing the process of each decision that we make as a city. So I wouldn't support trying to dictate within the overarching plan goals of the comprehensive plan one particular method of community engagement, again, because we have full documents and many actions, legislative actions as a council that speak to that much bigger issue. And so then kind of maybe the second point on that is, again, these are meant to be very high level goals. And so I know as council members were briefed one-on-one with staff, all had an opportunity to give feedback and edits. I know many of those were incorporated. I don't think there were a lot of edits coming through those meetings. But I think that staff reiterated there and again today that as we go forward here over almost the next year before we're adopting a final plan, these become the overarching goals that guide the policies that are underneath. And those policies are where we get into this very specific, maybe we do want to say our only method of engaging with communities through neighborhood organizations, but that would come in a bullet point that would come below this overarching goal. And I think the important point, because we're adopting goals here at this point in sort of interim piece of our plan process, to know that before now and the final plan adoption in 2018, we will have the opportunity to go back and edit these goals many times before the final document is adopted by the council, reviewed by the adjacent communities as required by the process, and adopted by the Met Council. And so if our bullet points coming underneath mean that we need to revisit the way that we've talked about community safety here in the 5th bullet and make it more specific, we'll be able to do that if we think that the underlying policies around public safety that I know staff is writing as we speak aren't reflected enough, right, is one example. And so I just would encourage everyone to sort of stay with the process here. We know we can iteratively reflect and rewrite the goals as we go forward if council members feel that their specific policy direction that they want to take as a city isn't reflected in the final document. Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And taking into account your point about committee protocol, staff directions are usually not the best way to go about things, in my opinion, in any instance. So I'm going to retract that. However, I think Councilmember Goodman brought up, I think, a much more sustainable framework for committee work, and saying that this is, even if it's a small fraction of the document that's moving forward to full council, if committee members feel that it's not quite ready, doesn't matter if it's the wrong color for a doghouse or whatever it is that we take up, we're saying it's not quite ready, we need to work it out. We do that time and time again with very little problems in that process, particularly in this committee, actually. And so yes, that is true. So respecting that, I want to retract that, ask my colleagues to deny the motion before us, and then take up Goodman's motion to move forward without recommendation. I think that would be the proper way to do it. So
Okay, so you made 2 recommendations for staff directions, and you're withdrawing both of them?
withdrawing both of them.
I do want to, okay, so,
But they will be noted as a heads up for what might be
sure.
needed for full council approval.
Right. So, Madam Clerk, I would like to call the roll on my motion to approve the resolution that was co-authored by Councilmember Reich and I. So please call the roll.
Councilmember Goodman?
I don't know what I'm voting on.
Madam Chair.
Voting this down and then vote yours.
Okay, so,
Madam Chair, you have another motion in front of you. Councilmember Wright made a motion.
oh, Councilmember, you're making a substitute motion.
I am. And that is to move forward without recommendation.
Okay. I didn't catch that. I understood that you were withdrawing your
Yeah, I'm
original
withdrawing
staff
that
direction.
and taking Goodman's approach to the matter.
Okay. On the substitute motion to move forward without recommendation, clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Goodman?
Aye.
Andrew Johnson?
Aye.
Barbara Johnson?
Aye.
Reich?
Aye.
Worsame? Absent? Chair Bender?
No. That motion passes. This motion has been moved forward without recommendation. I would encourage council members who didn't get a chance to give their feedback to staff after their one-on-one meetings or after the document was made public 2 weeks ago to please communicate with staff any edits they have before the final council meeting. And we are adjourned. Thank you.